When government violates your natural right to keep and bear arms, the founders considered this an invasion by government of your liberty. But they didn't just complain about it, obviously. They actually gave us a strategy, both in word and in action, to resist and defeat these enemy invaders of our essential rights. So on this episode, I'm going to share with you their warnings and their solutions, all of which has been ignored for way too long. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, January 27th, 2025. Let's kick it off here with Roger Sherman, one of the GOATs, here in debates in the House of Representatives. He said, "It is the privilege of every citizen and one of his most essential rights to bear arms." But wait, there's more. Sherman continued. He said, "and to resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made." Attacking your liberty. This is a term of warfare when they're going after you and attacking you like this. And certainly the founders saw attacks on your liberty as invasions. We'll get to that in just a moment. Now, Sherman didn't make this up. This was a widely accepted view of the founders and the old revolutionaries, and throughout the revolution. I think it's summed up best by Samuel Adams in his Rights of the Colonists in 1772. He said, "Among the natural rights of the colonists are these. First, a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property. And together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can." It's not up to government to determine what is the best manner to defend your own rights. He said these are evident branches of, rather than deductions from, the duty of self-preservation, commonly called the first law of nature. And the first law or primary law of nature was something that many of the founders and old revolutionaries considered the right of self-defense. Some people considered it a primary law of nature, but here's St. George Tucker and his view of the Constitution of the United States, probably the most important book on the Constitution from the early republic, published in 1803. He said the right of self-defense is the first law of nature. And of course, the founders, the old revolutionaries, they didn't make this stuff up. They didn't come up with it on their own. They were really just building upon the principles that they learned from the people that they read and learned from. One, for example, Algernon Sidney in his Discourses Concerning Government. He was put to death for writing this book and never even publishing it, just having it in his home and having written it. They killed him. He was considered a martyr for liberty, a hero to the American revolutionaries. This was published in, I think it was published in the 1690s, years after he was dead. But here's how Sidney put it. "Nay, all laws must fall, human societies that subsist by them be dissolved, and all innocent persons be exposed to the violence of the most wicked. If men might not justly defend themselves against injustice by their own natural right, when the ways prescribed by public authority cannot be taken." Or I would say if they fail, for example. John Locke built upon this as well in his two treatises, 1689. "Self-defense is a part of the law of nature, nor can it be denied the community, even against the king himself." And one other from one of the people that the founders learned from and read so widely, Thomas Gordon, one of the authors of Cato's Letters, here from number 42. "The two great laws of human society, from whence all the rest derive their course and obligation, are those of equity and self-preservation. By the first, all men are bound alike not to hurt one another. By the second, all men have a right alike to defend themselves." Now that brings me to discussions about invasions. It's an important discussion because the founders didn't just think that attacks on your liberty were just something simple to discuss. An invasion is not something you sit idly by and watch just happen. You resist it, for example. And here, one example of the ways they viewed this like that is in the Virginia Constitution, June 29th, 1776, they were discussing, for example, how George III created a detestable and insupportable tyranny. And they had a list of grievances there. For example, by dissolving legislative assemblies repeatedly and continually, and for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of the people. So in Virginia, led by George Mason and others, they saw that just legislative assemblies were getting shut down because they were opposing invasions of the rights of the people, because attacks on your liberty are basically weapons of warfare in many ways. You can consider that. Certainly Benjamin Franklin, during the Philadelphia Convention, said, all history has informed us that in every state or kingdom, there's been kind of a warfare between the governing and the governed. So this is not a surprising take whatsoever. Here's Samuel Adams also in a letter to Arthur Lee in 1775. He said, the people hold the invasion of their rights and liberties the most horrid rebellion, and a neglect to defend them against any power whatsoever, the highest treason. And this same type of language was certainly brought forward in the debates over ratification of the Constitution as well, from both the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. Here's Anti-Federalist writer Old Whig in his fourth essay. We ought carefully to guard ourselves by a Bill of Rights against the invasion of those liberties which it is essential for us to retain. Guarding against an invasion of liberties. This is not an invasion by a foreign power. This is an invasion by the general government, if we're talking about it in those terms, as Old Whig is describing it. St. George Tucker, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, described things like this. It is the proper object of a written constitution not only to restrain the several branches of the government, the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments within their proper limits, but also to prohibit the branches united from any attempt to invade that portion of the sovereign power which the people have not delegated to their public functionaries and agents, but have reserved unalienably to themselves. And if you think about the right to keep and bear arms and attacks on the Second Amendment by the federal government, for example, Congress in 1934 passed the National Firearms Act of 1934, signed by the executive branch. It's never been, held to be unconstitutional in any opinion by the Supreme Court. In fact, they may have upheld it. I'm not really a historian of the court here, but the court has never done anything about this either. And so over and over and over, we've got three branches, even just on that one so-called law, this act of usurpation, this invasion of our reserved sovereign power, rights, and liberties of the people of the several states. Just in that one instance, we've got them doing exactly what St. George Tucker discussed, uniting together as basically an enemy force invading our rights and liberties. That was St. George Tucker again. And Alexander Hamilton, I think, really tied it all together. Because if we've got a question, well, what do you do about it? Hamilton put all these principles together, of all people, here in Federalist number 33, discussing the Supremacy Clause. He said, it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. So if they don't have a power delegated over your natural right to keep and bear arms, which they do not, I've read the document, it's not there. So any of those federal acts are not the supreme law of the land. But what do you do about it? He said, first of all, these will be merely acts of usurpation. A usurpation is a theft of power that doesn't belong to them and will deserve to be treated as such. And how do you treat usurpations? How do usurpations of power deserve to be treated? How do invaders deserve to be treated? Well, they deserve to be thrown back from where they came. So we want to go back to the American Revolution again to see the same kind of principle put into practice in both word and then eventually in deed as well. Here from the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, October of 1774, they basically had a declaration where they listed a bunch of British acts where they considered to be impolitic, unjust, and cruel, as well as unconstitutional and most dangerous and destructive of American rights. So even though it was under the unwritten British Constitution, they said, well, you aren't authorized to do this under the system of laws that we've lived under. And then on top of it, they are destructive of American rights. Well, what do you do to so-called laws, usurpations of power that are destructive to your liberty? Well, they said this: to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. In other words, it doesn't matter what you pass, we cannot comply with them because they are unconstitutional and they are destructive of our liberty. And we see the same kind of thing in James Madison's strategy for how to stop the federal government from doing stuff it's not supposed to do, and also stop the federal government from doing stuff that is just bad policy that it's actually authorized to do, but shouldn't be doing because the people don't want them to do it. Just because something's delegated to the federal government in the Constitution doesn't mean they have to exercise those powers in whatever way they want. So in Federalist 46, Madison said states should use legislative devices, his phrase for it, so laws, resolutions, acts, whatever, to basically help impede the actions of the invasion of the federal government. And by doing that, using a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Again, that's in response to federal acts seen as unwarrantable or unconstitutional or warrantable. And this is for states and individuals, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. I should mention that all the stuff that I'm referencing in this episode, this is going to be included in a show notes section for a blog post for this episode. Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing blog posts for every single episode, and I get them published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So all these original source documents will be included there so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. You can also find all the various platforms we're on, both the video platforms and audio-only podcasts. That way, if we're missing from one at some point, you know where else you can find us. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But let's get back to it. James Iredell, who was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court, a leading legal mind of the time, here's how he described it in the North Carolina ratifying convention. He even pushed a stronger version of what Madison was saying. A refusal, legislative devices in the states, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union by the states and by individuals. Iredell said, the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. Now, how that plays out can vary based on the situation. In modern times, almost all federal programs rely heavily on states to do the enforcement or implementation. Even the National Governors Association, during one of those fake so-called federal shutdowns of the last decade or so, they specifically put out a kind of an alert concerned about it. They said states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And here's the dirty little secret they don't want you to know. Partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. So if you find a situation where the federal government passes something, but they rely on the states to implement it for them, if the states simply just opt out, well, then that act is defeated. That's something that Alexander Hamilton actually complained about. I don't have it in the show notes here, but just thinking about this off the top of my head, in Federalist number 16, he was explaining one of the reasons why they were trying to change the system from the Articles of Confederation, because under the Articles, Hamilton hated this, that most of the things that the federal government wanted to do really relied on cooperation from the states. And he said, look, we don't want this under the Constitution, because if the state's action, if the interposition, he said, of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, all they have to do is not act or act evasively, and the measure is defeated. Now, for us today, when the federal government has involved itself in so many things that it can't even do the things it's supposed to do without help from the states, that gives us a pretty green light for a very straightforward strategy. Anyway, so prevent its exercise could also, especially in modern times today, could involve literally just not doing the enforcement, kicking it back to Washington, D.C. They don't have enough person power to get the job done. We know the ATF, that unconstitutional agency that never should have existed in the first place, has around 5,100 employees. A little bit more than that. Sometimes it goes up and down. About a third of them are in administration. They just do paperwork and garbage that they shouldn't be doing at all anyways. So that leaves, I don't know, what, 3,500 or so? My math is terrible. I went to government-run school. So maybe 3,000 to 4,000 enforcement agents for the entire country. And they can close somewhere between 8 and 11,000 federal gun cases per year. Now that's 8 to 11,000 too many. But think of it like this. Let's say there were 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 million undocumented short-barreled rifles in violation of that National Firearms Act of 1934. There is a 0% chance that the federal government could make a dent in that, even with support of the states. Anyway, so the only resource, Iredell put it, against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. They don't get this from a document. You don't have to find this spelled out in any constitution or any law or any court case. It is their inherent natural right of self-defense. Because when government usurps power, they're stealing something that was reserved to the people of the several states. And what do you do against robbers and thieves? Well, you have to use your right of self-defense. Anyways, he continued, the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. Well, they're supposed to. They certainly did often in the early part of the Republic, but that kind of melted away, unfortunately. Now back to Alexander Hamilton. He saw states as an essential part of this overall strategy. Here in Federalist number 28, mind you, I'm citing Hamilton. He was the big government guy of the time. I am 0% a fan of Hamilton as far as his views on necessary and proper and the bank bill and so many other things. But when he was on explaining things, well, and maybe it was just to get things passed. Maybe there was a motive there, but he certainly really hammered it home. Here he is in Federalist number 28. He said, it may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. So we need to start viewing federal gun control. Would say we want to view all gun control, but let's say we're talking about the federal government. Let's view federal gun control as an invasion of our liberty that needs to be rejected, resisted, opposed, and nullified into oblivion as it deserves. And Hamilton went a little further to explain, the reasoning, the structure behind this. He said, the states can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty. So ultimately, it is the people and the states that have the duty and the right and the power to defeat usurpations of power by the federal government, invasions of our liberty. John Hancock in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention made this very clear as well. He said, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. Now, of course, it requires people to use those powers in order to have the security of their liberty. Here's Theophilus Parsons, also in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said, the oath the several legislative, executive, and judicial officers of the several states take to support the federal Constitution, because if you think about it, they're all taking an oath to support the Constitution. If the federal government passes something that violates the Constitution, if they help them do it, they are violating their oath. So they need to have a hands-off approach on almost everything. Now, we're talking about the right to keep and bear arms and attacks on the Second Amendment. They need to have a hands-off approach on gun control, but we absolutely can apply this across the board. So the oath the several legislative, executive, and judicial officers of the several states take to support the federal Constitution is as effectual a security against the usurpation of the general government as it is against the encroachment of the state governments. But, he said, there's something far better than this parchment barrier, these words on paper. There is another check founded in the nature of the Union, superior to all the parchment checks that can be invented. And if you think about how James Iredell put it, saying this is the inherent right of the people to do something about it to prevent its exercise. This is how Parsons is explaining it some months earlier, how you put that into practice. He said, if there should be a usurpation, it will not be on the farmer and merchant employed and attentive only to their several occupations. It will be upon the 13 legislatures, completely organized, possessed of the confidence of the people, and having the means as well as inclination successfully to oppose it. But what if your states don't get on board? What if your states are doing the wrong thing? We're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, back to Roger Sherman. Here's how he described things, talking about how states are an essential part of this system of keeping things in check, keeping things in line with the Constitution, and how we should view attacks on our natural right of self-defense, our right to keep and bear arms. All acts of the Congress, he said, not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. And I think from this simple paragraph, 2 short sentences, we can tie it all together with 4 essential points. 1, governments are going to do what governments do. When they want to violate your rights, when they want to usurp power, when they want to invade your reserve powers, invade your liberty, they're just gonna do it, whether you show them a piece of paper that says they can't or not. 2, telling them to stop, of course, doesn't work. They still continue to try to enforce their stuff. So he's saying, look, these acts are void, but they're still going to try to enforce it. And in response, in the federalist system, when a bunch of states refuse to go along, when they refuse to participate in that enforcement, the feds don't have the ability to get it done. And I think the most important thing is point number 4, because that requires the people to have a special kind of backbone. They have to refuse to comply because there is nothing to enforce. There's nothing for the states to help. There's nothing for the states to stop if the people just comply with whatever the federal government passes. So the foundation of all this is a willingness of the people to take a stand and refuse to comply with all this gun control garbage we've had for so many years. And again, we can apply this more broadly than that as well. Here's how Theophilus Parsons continued that same discussion. He said, but sir, the people themselves, he understood that this was the foundation of all of it as well, even though he's saying, like, look, these state governments have the power to stop the federal government if they decide to do it. But ultimately, the people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation without being driven to an appeal to arms. An act of usurpation is not obligatory. It is not law. And any man may be justified in his resistance. Now, again, in the context of this, Parsons isn't saying go out there and get into a shootout. He's saying defy them. He said, let him be considered as a criminal by the general government. Like if they say you can't own a certain magazine size, what if you just did it anyways? And enough people were on board with you doing it anyways. Well, he said only his fellow citizens can convict him. They are his jury. And if they pronounce him innocent, not all the powers of Congress can hurt him. And innocent, they certainly will pronounce him if the supposed law he resisted was an act of usurpation. So ultimately, we've got a kind of a multi-pronged game plan. That is, we first of all have to look at federal acts beyond the limits of the Constitution, all federal gun control. And I would say the same for state gun control under state constitutions. We have to look at these as invasions of our liberty. Then on top of it, we have to recognize that as long as people comply with it, it's not going to stop. And then when it comes to the federal gun control, all those attacks on the Second Amendment for so many decades, for almost 100 years now, we have to get the states. There are a handful of states that are probably willing to take the proper stand, and support the people living there as well. So you've got a kind of a multi-pronged thing. And then on top of it, you have jury nullification as the last line of defense for doing this without, as Parsons put it, being driven to an appeal to arms. Now, of course, we hear from people all the time that this stuff is outdated and, really the federal courts are the way we're supposed to go, because the federal courts, well, they're the ones who have the final say over the Constitution, and we got to get some good people in there, or maybe there are good people in there. We'll just wait for them to get the job done. But getting government to convince government to stop doing what government was never supposed to do is not the system of the founders. That is the system that they fought a long, bloody war to free themselves from. That's the British system. Basically, beg them to stop doing things, and they decide if they broke the rules. Instead, the American system is the people are the source of all power. They're the top of the food chain. And so they have final authority. The people of the several states hold sovereignty or final authority, and they have the final say on the limits of their own constitution. Not any part of the government, not the federal courts, not any of them at all. Here's how Madison put it in his report of 1800. He said, "The Constitution of the United States was formed by the sanction of the states given by each in its sovereign capacity." And the logical conclusion of that is this: the states then being the parties to the constitutional compact and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no tribunal above their authority to decide in the last resort whether the compact made by them be violated. So the final say over whether or not the Constitution, the compact, is violated is not the federal courts. It's not any part of the federal government. It's the states in their sovereign capacity. And James Madison made it very clear in that same document that states, even though it can be used, the term can be used in many ways. In this context, it means the people composing those political societies in their highest sovereign capacity. And he said, in that sense, the states ratified the Constitution. And in that sense of the term states, they are consequently parties to the compact from which the powers of the federal government result. And in that sense of the term, the people of the several states, there is no tribunal above the people themselves. And now, of course, really what it gets down to, in short, what people are saying, when you got to wait for the courts to make a determination, or you got to wait for a new administration to come in and do the right thing, what they're telling us is allow the government to determine the extent of its own powers. This was, in essence, the very definition to the founders of an arbitrary government, a tyranny. Thomas Jefferson described this idea of kicking it over to the courts rather than the people of the several states to have that final authority. He described it like this: "You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy." We've heard some warnings recently about an oligarchic system somehow growing, but as long as the people have been doing this, and for decades and generations, the people have basically said part of the federal government gets to determine if the federal government violated the rules given to the federal government by the people of the several states. We've, in essence, been living under an oligarchy for a long, long time. Now, as I just mentioned a minute ago, other people also just want us to wait for the current administration or a new administration to have time to start doing the right thing. And that is stop enforcing all the federal gun controls, disband the ATF, or stop hiring them. Just tell them to, stand down, whatever it may be. But Patrick Henry guaranteed that that attitude as well would absolutely end in a loss of liberty. In the long run, here's how he put it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention: "Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty." Because that's exactly what people are doing when they're saying, okay, well, these are the right people, and we're just going to trust them to do the right thing. And let's say they do the right thing. They're only going to be in power for a certain amount of time. They're not going to be there forever. And so then you still have to trust that the next group of people are going to be good people and do the right thing and love your liberty and follow their oath to the Constitution. Well, Patrick Henry said, "I say that the loss of that dearest privilege, our liberty, has ever followed with absolute certainty every such mad attempt." TLDR. Even if you don't read Patrick Henry's long speeches in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, like this one from June 5th, 1788, You have to understand that Patrick Henry warned us that relying on people with power to do the right thing when it comes to our liberty is insanity. Every now and then you might get lucky, but in the long run, you're going to guarantee a loss of liberty. So whether it's the courts or presidents or Congress, complying with attacks on our liberty, invasions of our rights, and then waiting for the federal government to self-correct, to fix the problems that it created in the first place, is not how a free people responds to a usurpation of power. Here's how John Dickinson warned us about this. When an act injurious to freedom has once been done and the people bear it, the repetition of it is more likely to meet with submission. I think James Otis Jr. may have really hammered it home with this one. Here, writing as free-born American in 1767, when our rights are invaded, again, invasion, when our rights are invaded, it is high time to throw aside prudence. He was rejecting the idea that, okay, well, maybe this isn't the right time. We should just slow things down. We don't need to take a stand on this. But when our rights are invaded, of course, because as Dickinson pointed out as well, it establishes a precedent for them to do more and more and more in the future. And ultimately, I think protecting and defending, at least according to the founders and the old revolutionaries, and I agree with them, protecting and defending our own liberty, and that includes our natural right to keep and bear arms, our natural right of self-defense, means that people need to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government happens to agree with them or not. And if they can happen to get their states on board, as Madison described, to use legislative devices, or Theophilus Parsons described, or as Roger Sherman described, to not enforce them, Alexander Hamilton and the rest, and tie that in with a mass refusal to cooperate with the Union on a state level as well, that's even better. It makes it much less difficult for the people to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the federal government happens to agree with them or not. And ultimately, I think it gets down to this. This is how Thomas Jefferson put it. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. There is absolutely nothing that helps us get this kind of message out, these essential foundational principles, this strategy, these warnings from the founders and old revolutionaries out to more and more people every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you like the work that we're doing and you want to help us continue this and expand it to much, much more, nothing helps us get that job done, like I said, than our membership program. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they quickly devalue day in and day out, our membership program starts out at just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Or if you want to make a one-time gift, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, that's all spelled out. I won't belabor the point, but I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work today. You can also help us spread the word by doing a bunch of other free and easy peasy things like reviews on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform, hitting the like button, leaving comments, subscribing, getting notifications on all the video platforms, and especially on the mainstream video platforms like YouTube. The more watch time you have, the more likely the algorithm is going to show us to more people. So all that stuff helps out a great deal. I'm very grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think and learn. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. And I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.